Hello, citizens of the world. This second broadcast and future ones is dedicated to the pathology of an incident. I was born 1945 in probably a month that I will forever consider and humanity will consider one of the worst that this planet has ever known. That is August 1945, when the atomic bombs landed on Japan in two cities. The start of nuclear warfare, chemical warfare, and the horrors that plague us. The purpose of my getting together with citizens of the world and the community at large is because I have always been troubled by the non existence of a philosophy in these United States that actually make no sense. However, they're interpreted as being patriotic. Patriotic as we exalted capitalism. We live in a society where we often hear that what is all for the best, and it is what it is. Now, when we examine those sentences, those phrases, to me, it speaks of our insanity and our decline of our humanism to hold ourselves responsible for what is. Things are not is because it is. They are because we made them as such. We are responsible for those incidents. My mother, and as I write it in my first book, An Other's Mind, was aware before the creation of Puerto Rico as a Commonwealth from 1950 to 1952, the creation of a Commonwealth, that this nation's focus on the accumulation of wealth created a country that demanded patriotism, exalted capitalism, but too often would not accommodate morality. That ideology is really our national anthem. That we really do not accommodate morality, and as we live in a society that needs and requires an anti-racist strategy. I learned early that it needed a project. What was that project? What was it going to be? The symbolisms of that project. I remember growing up in Harlem, 137th Street off Broadway, and later 125th Street in Broadway. My father getting up early in the morning. My father came from Caracas, Venezuela. And he would walk around with a lot of keys in his tied around his belt, and I still hear the jingling of those keys. As he got up at 5 or 6 in the morning, even during snowstorms, to open up the factory, a factory formed by Jewish people from Germany, they made chocolate, known as Copper's chocolate, an elite form of chocolate. And my father was the foreman of that factory for over 20 years. I remember going to visit him at his place of work to pick him up with my mother. Him very proud that he opens up and locks up the factory. I also noticed that the factory on Waverly Place by the Village in New York City was smack next to NYU, the University of New York, NYU. In fact, the building was owned by NYU. The building of the factory was owned by NYU. And that became a curse later on, as many decades later, NYU decided to purchase the building and it closed down the factory. And my father was lost again after so many years of being the first in and the last out. However, I did notice when I worked there in the summer that working in a factory or even owning it was not something that attracted me. What did attract me was seeing students come in and out of NYU with books, reading. And I remember telling my father as a teenager, someday I'm going to go to that. I'm going to go to that university. I'm going to be a student at NYU. Well, I did. I ended up getting my graduate degree in public administration from NYU. However, what marveled me was what made me desire to have a project in my life. Not to be the owner of keys, not to even be employed. As I reflect, the most precious moments in my life that I enjoyed the most was when I was attending the universities. I attended Hunter College School of Social Work for another graduate degree. I attended Union Theological Seminary. I had a passion for wanting to know what made me different, not intellectually different, but why I was so often a victim of racism. When I was in college, I was interviewing for a job upon graduating, and one of the jobs being offered, I went to business school, Pace College at that point, and they were having interviews for working in Wall Street. And I noticed during the selection of candidates that what would be called the Pat Boone attractive kind of applicant would be sent to train for selling stocks and bonds. And people that were, and us students that were not so white, offered positions in the back room. I did not let those analogies go by. I did not let the analogies of why, when my mother, who came from Puerto Rico, was a pianist, a beautiful pianist. She could play classical music. She could play anything. Yet, in Harlem, the Juilliard School of Music, I used to walk through the Juilliard School of Music to get it to go into my public school, to my Catholic school, which was on 119th and Broadway. And when it was cold, I would cut through the Juilliard School of Music and notice that all the students were white. None of them looked like my mother, though my mother could compete musically with her pianist, with her skills, as good as any of them. And she did play the piano for a group from South America. She was the pianist. And then when I went further to 120th and Broadway, I noticed that Barnard College, a part of Columbia University, had tennis courts where there are now buildings. And all the tennis players who were white females, Barnard was a female school at that point, and they would be playing tennis. None of the tennis players and none of the students looked like my mother or looked like me or my grandfather. This blatant sense of racism taught me early, so early, that I needed a project. And at that point, the project that I wanted was to be smarter than any other white person that I would meet. That assimilation would be a sickness, that assimilation destroys, but education creates. The artist creates. I walked a path where in harm's way. At this point in my life, I can proudly say that I have never been employed. Employment was not part of my cards. It was not in my cards. If I wasn't creating hell, if I wasn't doing something that was moral, I didn't want to do it. And I wouldn't do it. I got paid for being an artist. I got paid for being smart. I got paid for introducing morality, where those that were deemed and baptized as being the otherized could get a fair shot if I was in their midst. Yeah, I got terminated a lot, but I always found a place to hang my hat on where I could perform my art, where I can do justice, where I can live life with dignity and at the same time traumatized. Because what I do is traumatizing. I have learned many things, but among the most powerful is the belief that you cannot teach a lived experience. There is no way that my kids could understand the journey as to why I decided not to have a pension, to work in an environment where, at best, I would be living through my Social Security. I wanted, as the first person in my family, the first generation to be born in the United States, in Harlem, I wanted my kids to have what was denied me, a fair shake. And to do that, I knew that the cost of education, even at NYU at that point, at the point that I first met NYU, where it was $50 a credit during the 1970s and earlier, I knew that I couldn't afford. Either I put away money for my pension, or I took home as much as I could so that my kids would not have to lead the life that I wanted them to have. This formula is what I spoke about at my first broadcast here on LMC Media, where I mentioned that economic justice is the most important right that we have. Economic justice justifies the requirement of a revolution of sorts. We all have a part to play for the citizens of the world that will save this planet. When people cross the border from Latin America or whatever, and go across the Rio Grande and end up in Mamaroneck, Do you actually think the kids that were born in Mamaroneck from these parents are ever going to understand what it was to grow up to Rio Grande? Many will become assimilated and commit the same horrors that were done to their parents. Many will forget that because they happen to be light skinned, that they need not own their last name. We cannot, I cannot teach lived experiences because the concept of wanting more is destructive to any sense of morality. Democracy is a word that is supposed to define the United States. It doesn't define the United States. It didn't take me long when I was playing stickball in Harlem and Dwight Eisenhower was running for president that they would throw buttons, vote for Ike Eisenhower. What I caught on quickly was as soon as the president of the United States is elected, they start their rally for the re-election the following week. Presidents of the United States spend more time looking for their self-employment for the next 4 years before they even started completing the first 100 years in office. Look what's going on today. We call that democracy. How can so much energy and time and money be spent on running for election with the problems that we have here in the United States? The problems that we have that every time there's an incident, it's viewed as, look what happened. Well, what do you think happens when you live in a country that defines this side of the hemisphere, the New World? I used to love going to the Museum of Natural History. I still do. I mean, I don't go as often as I did when I was a kid, but I love the Museum of Natural History. And it always troubled me that here I am, I walk into the building, I see a dinosaur, I see gorillas, I see all the fossils of thousands of years, and then the Europeans that finally learned that there's another part of the world, they called it the New World. What part of this hemisphere is the New World? How arrogant can this country be? Where is this a new world? Because Europe didn't know we were here, we're the New World? This is where this sabotages our right to critical thinking. It sabotages us. When I was one of the great institutions that I went to, Union Theological Seminary, I read about Paul Tillich. I read about Ed Said. And Ed Said spoke about how Europeans invented the word Orient. There's no such place as the Orient. There's Asia. What gives the Europeans, the white Europeans, the right to write a dictionary and proclaim a statement that is so one-sided, sole for the purpose that they are to be those that defined the planet? Employment. We should live in a country where full employment is possible. Not unique. When they say the unemployment rate is down, well, it's a useless term because for anybody that's unemployed, the unemployment rate is 100%. As long as we have what we want, first of all, we don't even know what we need. We don't. We haven't. We can't tell the difference between what is a need and what is a want. The country makes sure that we don't know the difference. There is a difference, but you need to understand the strategy that has formed our eventual demise. I'd like you to listen to a broadcast that I've picked up while I was. I read a lot, and I study a lot, and I study philosophy a lot. I love philosophy, economics, history, which is why I spend a lot of time in my last session here at LMC Media, talking about Dr. John Hope Franklin and the Tulsa race riots. So let's pause for a while as we prepare the next few minutes.
A little over 6 years ago, I began a series of radio programs over the mother station of KPFK, that is KPFA in Berkeley, which have been running ever since under the general title Way Beyond the West. And I think I may as well take off for listeners in Southern California by a short explanation of that title. It obviously had a double meaning. First of all, geographical, in that the west coast of the United States faces Asia across the Pacific. And in that sense, the Asian world is way beyond the West. The second reason for choosing this title was that the English word way is the nearest translation, perhaps, that we can make to a Chinese word, Tao. You know that's spelled T-A-O. I don't know why, because it's usually pronounced Dao. And the Tao means many things. Primarily it means the way of nature, the way things go, the process of the universe. But it also means a way of life, a way of living in accordance with that process. And for example, in Japan, there are many crafts and arts, even sports, which have been influenced by Eastern philosophy, which are called ways in this sense. For example, you all know the word judo. Ju means gentle. Do is the Japanese way of pronouncing Tao, the gentle way. So Japanese also speak of fencing as kendo, the way of the sword. They speak of tea ceremony sometimes as chado, the way of tea. And in Japanese culture there are all sorts of these dos. And they indicate not only simply the technique, or mastery of the technique of performing the given art, they also carry the implication that the art involves a way of life. Indeed, in almost the ancient Western medieval sense, every art is a mystery. One used to speak, you see, of the mystery of being a goldsmith, the mystery of being a mason, stonemason, the mystery of being a carpenter. And that strikes us probably as extraordinarily peculiar terminology. But the meaning of it was that every man's vocation in life, what the Indians call one's svadharma, which means approximately one's own function, one's own calling. Every vocation, in other words, is also a way of initiation into the mystery of life, having somewhat a sort of religious function. So that The way is then the Tao in this title, Way Beyond the West. The way of deeper understanding, or something like that. But why do I say beyond the West, then, in that case? And the reason is that I think that we have not only obviously on the surface here lost the idea that our occupations are vocations. Oh no, not everybody has. But to a very large extent, our idea of an occupation is a way of making money. And we make a very, very destructive division between work and play. We spend 8 hours or whatever it may be at work in order to earn the money to enjoy ourselves in the other 8 hours. And that is a perfectly ridiculous way of living. It's much better to be very poor indeed than to do something so stupid as boring yourself and wasting yourself for 8 hours in order to be able to enjoy yourself the other 8 hours. And the result of this, when you get this fantastic division between work and play, is that work becomes drudgery and play becomes empty.
What's very hard for me is to practice what I preach. Paul Tillich spoke about the eternal. I process my thinking power to the eternal. I know time is broken up to past, present, and future. But I measure, however, not the word but, however, I do measure everything that happens with the possibilities of it being eternalized. Certainly, I raised my children, or I attempted to raise my children with the concept of eternalizing their thoughts, so their positivity and contributions to what they could create goes on forever. Because we can live forever. Maybe not our body, but certainly what we have to say should live forever on the minds of those that they have been blessed to touch. However, there are social traps. And my hardest social traps are those by those that are in power and should not be in power. By a community that is so hungry for the maintaining of a gentleman's agreement where what they wish may not be legal, but they make it happen. They make these things happen. So they legalize, there are ways of legalizing what's illegal, what is immoral, what should never be justified. I work with autistic kids. Many, well, the part that I'm working with now are nonverbal. Part of BOCES. If not 99% of the students there are black and brown. Yet, the leadership is white. It's an apparent apartheid for me in the way I view it, in the way I see it, in the way I see it function and not function. These elements of destructive but profitable entities has made the United States and a lot of its internalized mechanism unemployment agencies. Just like running for the President of the United States, running for Congress. How dare some of these people even run for Congress with the message that they have to give, and they give. And yet, we ponder as to why the incidents that happen do not get studied. If you're making money, you're doing well. That is a dysfunctional personality. To listen on the Metro North, people saying, oh, they report to this hedge fund, this hedge fund is doing well, and this person, and they quote people and they say this. What's the purpose of all this? What's the purpose of all this where I'd like to know what their kids are doing? I mentioned before that what is hard for me is to practice what I preach. And I referred to Paul Tillich. It's hard to practice what I preach because there are consequences that I become part of that are all negative towards me and negative in my desire to create good. In class, I often ask students to test our society for morality in the presence of patriotism and capitalism, because educational inputs are not necessarily aimed at the development of students' analytical, reasoning, and empathetic skills. What I look to install was the wisdom to know how to use all of these words to really grasp the most sensitive issues and tragedies created from neglect. But first, in class, we responded to the question of whether morality, wisdom, and justice and virtue need to be priorities over and above patriotism and capitalism for us to be functioning, educated, to be a functioning, educated democracy. That is some question. Is it possible? I don't think it is. I don't think it's in fact, I know it's not possible that patriotism, as defined in the United States, can create justice, empathy, and reasoning. It can't. Because it means that we are turning down the walls that create the otherized community. We are all otherized. And when we believe that, democracy will be functioning. But even here in Mamaroneck, there is those that live on the side of the track, those that live in Orienta, those that get flooded, those that can afford to go to the restaurants, and those that can't. Those that where the public schools are running as effectively as they do at the better neighborhoods, the more affluent neighborhoods in the Large Mamaroneck and Westchester area. I want to thank you for your time and understand that it is important to study the pathology of an incident. An incident does not live on its own. And we should forget that we are the ones that started nuclear warfare. August 1945. Thank you.